As I said, I'm Gerry Abbey, head of marketing here at Copia Automation, and recently published a report in my background, the second annual State of Industrial DevOps report. Last year, we did the first annual, and it was really interesting comparing the findings in this year's report. We asked a few new questions. I got really great feedback over the course of this year to help evolve the report. And it's still in its infancy. It's only two. We have two data sets to compare. We'll continue doing it year after year. But now that we have something to compare, it's more fun to really critically analyze that data. With that, I'm
Mhm.
going to pass it over to Vlad, if you wouldn't mind giving some context and introduction to who you are.
Absolutely. So my name is Vladimir Romanov. I have over a decade of experience, primarily on the technical side of manufacturing and industrial automation. By formal education, I have a double E as well as an MBA. Early in my career, I worked a lot for end users. I started at Procter& Gamble, moved on to Kraft Heinz, then Post Holdings in various engineering management, and maintenance management roles. So basically understand fairly well on the technical side how manufacturers operate, but also execute some of the longer term engineering initiatives. After the MBA, I spent a couple of years in a building essentially a DevOps startup, which is atypical, I want to say, for someone in manufacturing, but that gave me a whole other perspective on the IT side, right? Having worked a lot on the OT side, and we can get into those obviously nuances in the conversation. As of last year, I parted ways with that specific startup, so now I'm refocused. I do a lot of consulting as well as systems integration for different manufacturers. A lot of my ties are still in food and bev and CPG, so I come in with the context of those industries. And so I certainly have a lot of, I want to say, my own personal takes and maybe opinions as to where the manufacturers are when it comes to AI readiness and data ops and DevOps. And so we can, I guess I'm looking forward to the conversation today as we dissect some of those topics.
Thank you, Vlad. I've really
Yes.
appreciated the added context. I think it helps with a lot of what we're about to dive in.
Hmm.
And as this is an industrial AI focused fireside chat, we're going to lead in with the first question right on the nose there. So
Yes.
the report states 89% of leaders agree AI will unlock new efficiencies. You have a strong take on this, believing investment in architecture and infrastructure must come before AI. And I was actually just reading a report from MIT yesterday talking about the enterprise AI initiative failure rate being astronomical. And I think we're going to
Hmm.
be digging into some of this. So the question is, why is building that foundation more critical than jumping directly into AI tools?
Absolutely. And so there's a couple of points that at least I am witnessing myself. So, number one, I think to take a step back a little bit, I think when we say AI will impact business or manufacturing in general, it's important to recognize which areas of the business it is impacting, right? So, I would hope that both you and I, as well as the audience, agree that you can write, let's say, an email faster with AI. You can also create content arguably better, but ultimately faster with AI. You can process meetings, for example. So if you have a recording, you get the transcript, you can get notes a lot faster using AI. On the sales side, right? So if we talk about sales and marketing and other organizations, I think we have seen tangible ROI. So I think when you ask in a very broad sense, is AI impacting manufacturing? The answer is yes. But is it, and for the purposes of this conversation, is it impacting operations and sort of plant floor industrial data? And that is where I still see a fairly big disconnect from, the current systems and what it takes to get AI to give you a tangible response, whether that's even in machine learning or LLMs, and we can get into those definitions a little bit as well. But basically, until you have a strong data foundation in place, and again, that also is multiple bullet points, I think it is very difficult for many of these companies to see ROI specifically on plant floor industrial data. And that is where, like I said, my argument and maybe some not necessarily disagreement lies, but I think, like I said, in a general sense, yes, AI will and has been impacting manufacturing, but from the industrial sense and more specifically plant floor sense, I think it still has a lot of ways to go.
Yeah, great
Hmm.
points. It's all
Yep.
about context, and context
Yep.
I feel like as a marketer, I talk about all the time. You need context for your messaging
Hmm.
to make sure that it's understood. And it's the same thing when you're thinking about applications of AI. If it's not trained on the right amount of data, what's going to come back is going to be shallow and potentially wrong. And that's
Yep.
fine if I'm creating a white paper because I can quickly read it and say, oh, this is off. I'll get it, I'll update here, I'll update there. But when we talk about in this plant operations context, if it's wrong, there can be severe consequences.
Yep.
So before I move to the next question, I
Mm.
wanted to dig into one point that you and I had talked about when we were prepping, and that's MCP, the Model Context Protocol. I hear about it everywhere. I'm seeing it all over my LinkedIn posts. I see it all over at conferences like Ignition's ICC and FabTech. I was at both recently. Would you mind
Mhm.
giving a little context on MCP for our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess I want to not have the expectation that everyone understands how LLMs are built and how MCP works. So let me start with a very simple example because I think the question of context, as you've mentioned, has been a topic of conversation in manufacturing in a broader sense for many years, if not decades, right? And this comes down to the fundamental connection between your PLCs and the mechanical world, right? So if you see there's a couple of devices behind me. If I tie in that PLC to sensors as inputs, and obviously I'm then actuating certain motors, certain valves, actuators for the purpose of the process, I, as the engineer, need to specify what is tied to that PLC. To the PLC, it's nothing but high-low voltages, and obviously for an analog value, it's going to be a range usually 4 to 20 milliamps or 0 to 10 volts. But the point is, the engineer that's going to design that system gives that PLC and that program context as to what is connected to the PLC. So similarly, when we talk about LLMs, if you go into ChatGPT, what they've basically done, and I'm oversimplifying this as the explanation, they've basically absorbed all of the content that they can, in a private or I guess in a public setting, consume from the web, and then they're able to give you a response based on a statistical analysis based on your question. What is very difficult for just a pure LLM, and now there's been some advancement here, is you can feed it an image and now it's able to also parse the image. You can now feed it a CSV, it's also able to parse the CSV. And so that is basically components that add extra context to your question, right? So the MCP is basically building on top of that. It is built by, it could be built by the OEM, it could be built by any third party really, but it is a adaptation of getting the information that the LLM doesn't inherently understand in a way that it does, right? So again, going back to my question, or I guess the example of the PLC, if I just collect raw data in, for example, in a SQL database, and I send it to the LLM, it's impossible even for the LLM or a data scientist looking at the data to tell, what information is what. So you need to provide it context for that specific data set. So the MCP can be broadly used for a variety of different applications. And so for plant floors, it could be, we were talking about process and how you need to understand the process. Well, maybe it's P&ID diagrams, right? So the diagrams that are usually drawn in CAD files and are going to be, presented either in a PDF or a CAD drawing. Well, there could be an MCP build to send the context of that drawing with, let's say, the data set, and then you can understand, well, if I have a pump that goes down here, this pump depends on that specific flow. So then the LLM can infer further, well, if the event occurs where this pump has gone down based on the information, therefore, this pump is going to fail in the next 5 minutes, whatever the data set indicates. And hopefully that is a clear enough explanation, but basically it is just a contextualization for data for LLMs that they do not inherently understand.
No, that was super helpful, Vlad. It's the last few years I've worked at a few different organizations looking at MES data, looking at SCADA data, looking at ERP data
Mhm.
across Plex systems, Rockwell Automation, and now Copia looking at industrial code. And thinking about the masses of data that comes out of manufacturing, it's helpful to think about that as unorganized data, and it's not readily set for an LLM to be learning from.
Mhm.
And hearing your explanation helps me better understand that MCP layer to set the baseline for effective industrial AI.
Yeah, and of course, again, there's a whole lot of layers that we didn't discuss, but ultimately, it's going to be a bit more complex than obviously we can cover in this conversation. I think it's important to recognize that different applications are going to have not only numerical data, they're going to have different events, maybe fault codes. So you need to be able to present that in a way that the LLM can digest. Because if you, and again, if you spend some time playing even with ChatGPT, but maybe further with Claude Code or Cursor, tools that build software, if you don't provide them enough context, then again, enough can mean different things depending on what kind of an outcome you're looking for. They're not going to give you as I want to say concrete of an answer that maybe you're expecting. And so the more you can provide, usually the better. And I say that a bit in air quotes because there's also been research done and there's been white papers published on the fact that if you put too much context into some of your queries, that can also lead to other situations or issues. But that's a whole other conversation, I would say.
Cool.
Hmm.
Let's move into our next question that we have here
Yes.
today. And this will be a little bit of a transition. And it's something that I found fascinating. And going back to the infancy of these data sets, we have two reports that we're going off of and trying to unpack what the audience that we are blind to is saying. They came back with this really interesting confidence paradox where
Hmm.
82% of leaders said they are highly confident in their asset inventories, which immediately when I was looking at the Excel raw data that came back, I was surprised. And
Yes.
everybody I've talked to, and you especially, you said in your experience, most facilities can't even answer this question. We've had discussions with customers, prospects that have said similar, and they can't answer the question of what does your network look like, let alone having that high of a level of asset inventory confidence. Is this overconfidence the single biggest unseen risk in the industry right now? What is your hot take on this?
So, look, I guess just really briefly to define assets again, because I think it can mean different things in different context. So, there's obviously the assets when we're talking about, let's say, a manufacturing line. So, you could have your, let's say, case packer, palletizer, whatever machines, and those are usually tracked by, SAP and operations. Those are fairly easily understood because they're visible and usually they're part of the ERP and your accounting. But ultimately, when we talk about assets, it's more your network devices, as you've mentioned, right? So those are going to be your controllers, your IPCs, your edge devices, maybe your SCADA and MES servers at the plant level. It could also be a variety of different other network devices, right? Your VFDs, your servo drives. And so I can tell you, again, from experience, because I do a lot of plant assessments in my work, before you can confidently pitch a solution or an automation system to a manufacturer, you need to be very diligent as to what's currently there. And I can almost always tell you that the exercise reveals a lot of hidden things that have been deployed by operations long after, the original equipment or line or facility was built. And to be honest with you, just undocumented, right? So you would show up to a facility, and that's why it is important to do some of these assessments because you need to understand, again, what's at the plant, what's on the network. You cannot simply blindly bring in a new machine and, again, fundamentally, let's say, assign the same IP addresses that you have assumed are not taken by other devices. So I think my general take is that there's a lot of confidence that we have everything in place, and I receive a set of drawings or I receive a set of basically a spreadsheet of items that are on the network, but almost always it is, how would I say it, we find other items once we get to the plant and start digging a little bit deeper.
I love that you called that out because one of the things that I've written about a few times and think about all the time is this shadow OT where people just want to get something installed so they can make progress and continue
Hmm.
advancing their systems, modernizing, and they go around the protocols that are built for maintaining security that can sometimes seem onerous. And when you
Yep,
dig
yep.
in and find that, there's this whole other bucket of concern that if you have these devices that are unknown, that are connected potentially outside of if you're operating in a Purdue model, you think you have a DMZ segmenting the network, you have a surprise device or many devices. As one of the data points from our report this year, the
Mhm.
average enterprise has around 4,000 devices, saying around 2,000 PLCs and then associated devices. When you think about that device sprawl, is there going to be one device that you're unaware of that might be violating those protocols? Maybe two, maybe a lot more. That's a whole other bucket of concern to think about. And when you're at these plant floors doing assessments, are you seeing and hearing that conversation as well, Vlad?
So I think this goes back to, I guess the short answer is yes. I think that this goes back to the fundamental differences between IT and OT, right? And it's not necessarily to say that there's a right or a wrong. I think there needs to be some sort of a balance. Whether or not there is a balance is obviously a separate question. But ultimately, if you've been in an OT environment, basically you're concerned with running as many basically products at the end of the line that are of good quality as possible, right? And so all the KPIs, all of your metrics, if you have a line that is down that you can fix with duct tape, if you can bypass, a firewall requirement that allows you to run, if you can add a device that will let you run for the next 3 hours while you're waiting on the vendor to get that device replacement, that's what you're going to do, right? And that's simply the reality of many engineering as well as maintenance teams and ultimately operations teams out there. And I think until you've experienced that, it may seem horrific and chaotic, but that's just the nature of the manufacturing business. You want to make sure that the lines are running at almost any cost, right? And I say almost any cost because obviously you don't want to violate some safety and OSHA standards. But when it comes to some of the cybersecurity or maybe IT regulations, I think they're a lot less understood on the plant floors, at least in my experience. Now, when it comes to IT, the focus is usually different, right? And that's because, again, engineers that come out of those programs, either in software or cybersecurity, they're much more risk aware from the software side, right? And so they're trying to mitigate risk as a result of, let's say, obsolete systems that have known vulnerabilities. And they are published. This is, open information that you can find online, which is very difficult for them to mitigate or even contain despite all of their efforts. But like I said, the fundamental difference is that the KPIs are very different. So there's going to be a lot of conversations that can result on either side, depending on, and again, this is just my experience on how strong, the leadership of that specific team is. So either it's the director of operation, or on the other side, maybe a director or VP of IT, whoever has more buying power within the organization is usually going to dictate how those devices are going to be scanned, how those devices are going to be backed up, upgraded, et cetera, et cetera.
And one point to add there. because I
Mhm.
think about this all the time. You could have the strongest leader, but if he is not collaborating with the team, if there is not a strong team there as well, there's always going to be blind spots. And even with
Yep.
efficiencies within the team, if you're not asking the right questions, there's going to be blind spots as well.
Yeah, and I would say, look, to that point, I've been in many of those conversations, and the usual question that the manufacturer would ask, well, how can we bridge the gap between our IT organization and the OT plant level folks? And there is no, I want to say, like single-handed answer. It's very difficult to answer that question. I think for me, it's always being very good at conveying the risks and the associated costs for those risks on your side, right? What I mean by that is if I'm in IT, I can, like I said, pull up the list of vulnerabilities and very clearly explain here are the issues we are currently exposed to these risks. Is the risk great? Is it small? That's up to you, obviously, to make that assessment. But ultimately, it can cause us to be down for, there's again examples, weeks or even months at a time to resolve some of those issues. So the question is, if we're going to implement maybe some of those short-term initiatives, maybe we're exposing ourselves to a risk of being down, however that may be, of X amount of dollars by doing so. Similarly, on OT, ultimately the customer who's receiving your finished products is going to complain if you're down because you've been patching the systems or reworking the networks or connecting data. They quite frankly do not care about any of that besides getting their product into their distribution centers or finished goods. And so operations needs to be able to make the case, hey, if we want to patch these systems or if we want to upgrade or if we want to make changes to the servers that run, again, critical SCADA or MES infrastructures, well, maybe we have to wait 3 weeks to a month because every time we go for, 2 hours worth of downtime, this is what it's going to cost for the customer. So I think explaining those details is usually what helps drive and sort of move the conversations forward.
Yeah, and I love that you pointed that out because that's another critical finding within the report, the high cost of downtime per hour and the pressure
Hmm.
it puts on individuals that are in there. Because
Yep.
thinking in practical terms, like you just framed it up, it's a lot easier said than done when you're dealing with all of the realities that are moving. Um, and I'm going to move on to our next question. I know we could
Yes.
on every one of these topics probably for the whole time. So
Yes.
a little shift here back to thinking about AI. And we had this integrity paradox come up.
Hmm.
The report says the teams are demanding AI. So we asked about AI usage, a lot of different AI questions, and the majority of respondents are looking to use AI for really complex tasks, including real-time code analysis and optimizing PLC logic. You were skeptical at this, arguing that AI can't be trustworthy in OT yet because the consequences of failure are physical, not just digital, like we've touched on a
Hmm.
little bit so far. What
Hmm.
would it take for an AI to earn that trust on the plant floor? And I had an add-on question for this one, Vlad. Earning the trust, is it a staged process? Do you introduce AI in some type of tiered usage?
Yeah, so let me, I guess, start answering this question maybe with a brief, real anecdote, right? So I've been to many plants again in the food and beverage industry, and a lot of my, or I guess many of my years have been spent tying in plant floor data into SCADA and MES types of systems. And so what you still see on the plant floors, even of some of the most advanced manufacturers, some of the largest companies in the world, I would put it, right, based on their market cap, is they don't have a ton of data in most of their facilities. They obviously have it on the control system side, so in their PLCs and IPCs and edge devices, but you can still walk on to plant floors and see someone count the number of pallets that have been produced in the last few hours and label that on a whiteboard, and they have like a trend line, for how many pallets they have achieved. And so where I'm going with this to tie this into the confidence question is when you show up to those plant floors and you put a simple sensor at the end of the line to count the number of cases that they've been produced, right? Just picture a conveyor belt with just cases coming out at the output of your case packer or palletizer, and you have a proc sensor that is reading basically each case one by one, and then you present that number to that specific manufacturer, that specific plant. I can tell you from personal experience, if you miscount the number of cases even once, right? They obviously will compare what your data is telling them versus what the reality is. They will lose all confidence in any other data that your system is collecting. And the problem with that is it's very difficult to regain that confidence, right? And so this will impact not only obviously the project, but also the operators will start to complain, well, the system is not worth a whole lot. It's giving us erroneous data, even if you fix the issue, right, Gerry? So a lot of times we would fix the issue and then we would add tags for, again, more advanced data. So understanding, for example, their batching process. And of course, the same argument remains, hey, we didn't get the counts right. How can we trust this batching system that's now in place? So the point here when it comes to AI, first and foremost, I think that we need to reach a consensus as to what the confidence level acceptable for manufacturing is, not even on the control system side, right? Before we start modifying code and optimizing code, but just presenting and synthesizing data that's coming off the plant floor. So I think that's step number one. And I think we either live with a degree of maybe one time out of 10, this is going to be an issue, or maybe we can get that to 100% always accurate. But I think that is a fundamental challenge that needs to be overcome before we can move forward with anything else whatsoever.
Great points. And just thinking about like
Yep.
simple example you gave of getting a count wrong once and taking it back to just confidence in technology in general, because I've seen and heard and been a part of those conversations, as I mentioned, like from everything to an MES deployment, ERP deployment, or something lighter weight like QMS or industrial DevOps and getting in there to manage your code better in a more professional way. But those fears of technology going wrong persist. And I know we're going to talk about that a little more later.
Yeah, and look, the fear is, I would say, a little bit unfortunate. I can tell you again from those specific examples that I gave and experiences, it is always, how would I say it? It's not even always that the system is wrong. It could also be that, again, the sensor got knocked down during the night shift, that therefore it got the wrong count. It could be, you're measuring, like I said, a massive tank. Imagine 40,000 pound tank that is brewing a recipe, and the sensor just got missed on it from whatever other process. You're misreading, obviously, that information, and you're being told that the system is incorrect, where in reality, you don't expect that tank to be subjected to, a construction site environment right next to wherever that batch is being made. But you are ultimately liable as the person who has implemented the system. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'm worried that if we deploy AI too prematurely, everything will be blamed on AI when it comes to operations, right? And of course, as I've said, there's nuances. AI can be very helpful in a variety of different ways. Talking about networks, there's a lot of developments on scanning the networks automatically. There's a lot of ways to use AI, for example, to proactively, again, scout the pages that write about vulnerabilities and be able to present that for specific devices. So I think, again, just to take a step back, I think what I'm saying is there's a lot of, or there could be potential issues when it comes to operating equipment using AI. Of course, if you just extract data and if it's wrong, like I said, you lose confidence, but ultimately you haven't necessarily run into the risk of breaking equipment or, even worse, causing damage to the personnel personally. But again, maybe to take a step back to this question, I had a lot more notes. I think there's a lot of complexities and nuances in our industry as well. And just really briefly, right, again, I mentioned the PLCs a little bit. The current design system for control systems is based in ladder logic. So whether you want it or not, it's a lot more difficult for AI or LLMs to absorb, right? So until somebody builds, I want to say, cohesive MCPs, and you have some kind of a maybe an API as well that can parse the logic, it is very difficult for LLMs to analyze, contextualize, and write it better. Number two, I think our industry in general is smaller. So when we're talking about tools like I've mentioned a little bit, Cursor or Cloud Code or Lovable that are able to code entire either websites or small applications, the code bases for traditional software have been a lot greater. So I think there's just a lot less materials that cover PLC programming. So trusting AI with the little knowledge and relatively speaking it has is very difficult, right? And like I said, there's going to be a lot of questions, of course, on operating real machines because then you're going to be blamed for any issues and all of the above, so to speak, for AI being the problem, and it's going to be removed rather quickly unless it's in an R&D type of an environment.
Those are all great points. And in our own experience here at Copia, we brought in AI to PLC coding last year after
Hmm.
extensive alpha and beta testing with customers, and
Okay.
even before that, training the model and making sure that the outputs align with our expectations. So
Hmm.
we found really good use cases for documentation of the code, putting it out. All the results and feedback from customers is that it's been very accurate and super helpful to get that documentation done because it's one of those things that nobody really has the time for because of all the things we've already talked about and more anyway. And then it's also been really helpful with summarization to
Hmm.
understand what that PLC logic is doing. So it's helpful for people that are onboarding or new to the company. Some of our customers even talked about interns having a faster time to onboard and actually do some coding and help have more of a business impact, which has been really interesting. For
I,
creating
mhm.
code, oh, go ahead, Vlad.
I was going to comment, and I think that resonates with me very well because, as you can imagine, a lot of equipment, well, number one is undocumented, especially on the PLC side or poorly documented. But number two, and I've experienced this myself multiple times, you get machines from overseas in a different language, and it's not just a question of translation, but they program in a different way that makes it very difficult, even if you just translate the comments that they've left, to understand what the functionality of the machine is. And of course, you can, given enough time, you'll obviously be able to dig through it. But if there's tools that can simplify that process, it is extremely beneficial. I can tell you, I have a project actually right now that I'm supposed to be briefed on where they're bringing in multiple lines from Germany. And as you can imagine, all of the German engineering went into building those machines, which is very robust and good, but ultimately all of the documentation as well as the code is annotated in a language that I don't personally understand. So I think documenting and be able to, again, query against some of that documentation would be an excellent step for sure for AI.
I love that you brought that up. So one of the other use cases we found without saying anything about it that
Mm,
people are using our Copilot in different languages. So we've seen a bunch of Chinese
mm.
usage and Italian usage, and it seems successful from our conversations and follow-up with the customers who are doing it. But that wasn't one of the things that we had intended when building it out, and more of
Mhm.
one of those organically evolving things that surfaced as customers were looking for ways to better utilize what we put out there for them.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense.
Cool. All right, let's dig into our next question.
Hmm.
This touches on some of the points that you brought up earlier, thinking about that
Hmm.
pressure on the plant floor. The report highlighted that 81% of organizations are using quick fixes, very similar data to the report last year, which was around 79, 80%. So consistency year over year. And you added that the joke in manufacturing is that a temporary fix becomes a permanent solution. How does this culture of firefighting and the reliance on a patchwork of tools prevent companies from building that solid foundation needed for the things we've touched on for security, for AI usage?
Yeah, I think it's only going to become a greater and greater challenge as we have more concerns and legislations with cybersecurity. I look, as I've mentioned to you, I don't think that the operations floor is going to necessarily change. I think we're going to see just as many patched solutions as we've seen in the past. And like I said, it's very difficult to paint that picture for someone that hasn't experienced that or lived through that. Ultimately, you have to do whatever it takes. And again, there's many different examples, right? It could be something as, I've mentioned bypasses or, replacing a device with something different. It could also be, heavy restrictions on the IT side or when it comes to programming stations or engineering workstations. And it simply is a standard that is enforceable maybe at the corporate or office level, but someone on the plant floor that needs to maintain equipment from 20, 30 years ago, sometimes even longer than that, well, they need to have access to a laptop that runs. I've had to run DOS in facilities not that many years ago to be able to program some specific devices, connect into those machines via parallel ports, and inevitably that laptop needs to be able to, download certain software or be able to load a patch. And so in certain instances, you need to bypass the quote unquote IT security to keep the plant floor running because it is very difficult to, how would I say it? Again, pitch from the OT side to the IT that we have these systems that are this old that need to be maintained. So I guess to answer your question, a lot of these fixes are in place and they get left in place until there's budgets to, again, migrate from the obsolete equipment to modern equipment. And that is a whole other, I want to say, can of worms because you're also fighting that cycle of, your accounting best practices are going to dictate that we want to depreciate your equipment over 30 years, but the manufacturers of some of the PLCs, your servo drive, all of your sort of runs that equipment is going to be obsolete in to 7 years. So inevitably, you're going to have to invest more money to modernize, and that is, how would I say this? That is not something anybody wants to do. They want to just simply run it for 30 years and make sure it's producing product. But with the risks on the IT and cybersecurity side, of course, it becomes very difficult. So the OT teams need to find whatever workarounds they can to make sure the system is running.
Yeah, and that's such a great point of the prioritization of funds and having the availability. And one of the things I often bring up when getting in these discussions is thinking about what is your top vulnerability, because you can't fix everything instantly, but think about those like 1 to 3 top areas that you want to address, something that might have been a patch and you really need to come back to. It's always important to think about and compartmentalize with prioritization what that biggest need is.
Yeah, and again, those conversations are very, very difficult, right? When you talk to someone at the director or VP level, is the question, I guess, what is more beneficial for the company? Do we invest 10 million into a new production line that will increase our capacity by 20%, or do we upgrade equipment that will, quite frankly, net us not a whole lot from a productivity standpoint, but will protect us again on a to some extent quantifiable vulnerability maybe, right? So I think that's why it is very important to collect all the data necessary and be able to come into those conversations with tangible examples and use cases as to what can happen, what is the what is the team currently doing to address some of those, again, quote unquote, temporary fixes? How are they running the equipment and why is this a problem? Versus, like I said, it's very easy for me to calculate how much cost is going to go into a new line. And based on the historical data, this is what that line is going to generate for the business.
That's a great last point. I love that context leading into our last question,
Mhm.
thinking about industrial DevOps. And to give more context before I actually ask the question, Copia was founded as an industrial DevOps platform to help bring those DevOps tools to the OT space. And
Mhm.
we continue to evolve what we're doing as we've gotten feedback from customers over the years. And that industrial DevOps messaging is moving more towards industrial code lifecycle management because there is all this code out there. We've touched on a bunch of it with the PLCs. It is the backbone of automation, and it needs that critical asset management approach, beginning with thinking about security, backing all of it up, because if there is an incident, you need to have it backed up. And I'm finding, though I'm going to ask about industrial DevOps next, it's this evolved piece within industrial DevOps of industrial code lifecycle management, really managing the lifecycle of that code. So going back to architecture and setting the right foundation, the report opens with this massive stat. 92% of our respondents said that they have invested or plan to invest in industrial DevOps within the next year. Vlad, you've worked on both the OT side, the IT side, and have unpacked a lot of your personal experiences today. Will industrial DevOps, industrial code lifecycle management, the whatever you want to use as the words around it, will treating your code as a critical asset help with industrial AI and how organizations approach use cases?
I would say absolutely, right? And I think maybe to paint you a better answer slash thesis, I think it's important to recognize that COVID, right? And again, we use this like COVID was a precursor to a lot of different things, but I think it opened up the conversations to, whatever was on the OT side, it was basically managed by plant engineers, and as long as things ran, everyone was quote unquote happy, right? As we started to transition into some remote work, as we started to allow remote connectivity to PLCs, as we created more and more bridges between OT and IT, I think that's where the problems, but also some of the solutions to those problems began to be researched quite heavily by manufacturers, right? And so DevOps is not a new concept in traditional software. I think it is definitely fairly new and still being experimented with in many manufacturers. And I think that as they bring in stronger and stronger IT teams, they understand the value of DevOps in the industrial space, right? And so DevOps is many different facets, and I think there's many different, obviously, problems and solutions. But to your point, I think that up until you had that connectivity, OT hardware and software was treated more of as a, again, like I said, a plant asset that as long as it's running, it's perfectly fine. But now we're realizing that it's a lot more than that. And a lot more than that in multiple senses. Well, number one, it can be optimized, right? But it more fundamentally just needs to be managed in a way that allows us to recover from risk, right? And this is not just cybersecurity risks, there's other operational, I guess, problems that can cause issues to, let's say, your OT or your PLC code. But ultimately, the basic premise of just backing up all of your systems that are critical to your production, and as we've discussed, the downtime can be thousands and thousands of dollars on a even per minute or per hour basis, is extremely important. So fundamentally, recovering from that downtime is as important as being able to prevent it. So number two is preventing that downtime as much as possible. Number three is trying to optimize the runtime of your equipment. And again, how that is done, if it's automated through AI or if it's manually done by engineers who are getting some of that data is obviously up for debate. But I think the practice of DevOps is absolutely critical to manufacturing and any, to be honest with you, organization that deals with software. I think it's just the fact that we're only now kind of realizing that OT is very software heavy when it comes to control systems. And it's only growing because, again, we're trying to get the data. Well, getting the data basically means you have to run applications that can extract the data, contextualize the data, transform the data, and then store the data, right? This is your standard, maybe databases, workflows. So a lot of steps are involved on both OT and IT when it comes to managing those deployments.
Yeah, and to your last point there, for OT, having the right tools that can do all of that. And while there's been DevOps tools in existence for almost 2 decades, there's been a lack until the last 5 years or so of OT DevOps tools. And that's where this
Yep.
industrial DevOps term came out of.
Yeah, and for many organizations, again, I think the short answer always is it depends, but ultimately it depends on the scale of organization, right? So if I have a couple of PLCs like in the field, that's perfectly fine. I can manage that on my laptop. It's not ideal, right? But it's a low risk, I get, or lower risk in general situation. But as you start to scale, as you have global presence, it is very difficult. And I think until you've again been in that position, very difficult to manage all of those deployments. And DevOps is basically tools that allow you to make sure that you don't crumble at the first presence of any issue whatsoever in those specific instances. And I think if you work in those environments, you will very quickly realize how difficult it is without proper tooling. And again, naturally, you will turn to the software industry and start asking questions. Well, what has been done here for many years? And they do have a lot of those answers. They're just not as adapted to OT for, again, a variety of reasons as we would like. So I think it is a very big need for sure in our industry.
So with that, I'm going to
Mhm.
open it up for questions. If you're in the audience and would like to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A and we will answer it live now. While I give some space for you to enter those questions, Vlad, we went through a bunch of questions. I loved our
Mhm.
conversation today. Really appreciated hearing all of your feedback and experiences. Is there anything I didn't ask that you wished I'd asked, or any part that we've touched on today that you'd like to close out, elaborate on?
We can talk, I guess, on a more positive note. So sometimes, maybe I paint a pessimistic picture when it comes to AI. I think that it is quite the opposite, right? So I remain positively optimistic. I can tell you that I'm personally experimenting again with some of the coding tools that I have mentioned, building out different applications. So I think my message to anyone maybe listening to this either live or when it is published, it's experiment for yourself, right? So take the time to not only query ChatGPT, but also go a little bit beyond that. Try to build a simple application. It is not that complicated. So if you follow the right tutorials on the web using Claude Code or Cursor or Lovable, there's many different examples right now. You can build fairly interesting applications, but more importantly, you will also see some of the limitations, right? And you will also run into different bottlenecks when it comes to credits, for example. So all of the LLMs, when you're not paying for the, let's say, monthly ChatGPT subscription, you're going to be constrained by the usage of credits and how much context you can give it, but also, again, to the earlier question, by the context provided by something like MCP. And then you can start looking and figuring out, well, what kind of an MCP do I need for my specific query? And what does it take to integrate that? And what kind of an answer am I getting? Am I satisfied with the answer? Do I need to give it more information? Right. So I guess my point is I would encourage everybody to experiment with AI on their own so that they can then have a lot more very tangible conversations with people coming in and bringing that into the plant floor.
Thank you, Vlad. We did get one question while you were answering that one. Have you
Hmm. Oh,
seen the benefits of transitioning code to structured text to better utilize AI given the limitations of AI with ladder logic, something that you and I had talked about when we were prepping.
So it's a very interesting question because actually in our prep, and I'm trying to pull up on the um, onto the answer that I gave here, and this is, let me see here, Vlad notes, and this is question number 3. I actually wrote that I believe, right, and this is a general assumption, is I think that more control systems will be built out using structured text for that specific reason versus ladder logic. I obviously don't know how many companies will transition to that, but I think it's a couple of factors, right? So people who are graduating today, and this has been a conversation for many years, obviously are usually trained on C or Python or Java or JavaScript, depending on what they've done. So they are more naturally inclined to write structured text. But number two, to that same point, AI is capable a lot easier to write structured text. So again, I'm not sure what the percentages are going to be, but I have made the same exact comment and assumption. I think more code is going to be written in structured text as a result of AI being better on that side.
And just to add on there, I mentioned Copia's AI features earlier. Our AI also translates from ladder logic into structured text and vice versa. So lots of opportunity there with tools that exist today. Another
Mhm.
question came in. How do you use AI in IDS monitoring in the OT environment?
So I'm assuming by IDS, he's talking about cybersecurity monitoring on the OT side. I don't brand myself necessarily as a cybersecurity expert. I have some experience using a tool called Clarity. And so I have, I guess, some knowledge as to how they're being able to tie, basically their sweep of different hardware to, as I have mentioned, some of the vulnerabilities found for that specific vendor slash hardware. But I guess I'm assuming that there's going to be a lot more advancements on that side to come. I just don't have as much context dealing with cybersecurity specifically issues than that.
Thanks, Vlad.
Mhm.
Any other questions? I'm not seeing any other new ones, and I'll give it another 30 seconds in case anyone's frantically typing in there. While we give it that little bit of space, Vlad, if people want to follow up with you, where can they find you?
Yeah, I would say get in touch with me on LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest place to find me. Should be able to reach me fairly easily. I have my own website, joltec.com, if you want to check out some of my content as well on there, or send me a contact through there directly.
Thank you. And
Mhm.
if you want to access the findings from this report, you can go to copia.io and you'll see it highlighted right there on the homepage. And if you have questions, follow up for me, you can reach me at Gerry@copia.io or likewise find me on LinkedIn. So, Vlad, I
Awesome.
want to thank you so very much. Loved our conversation today. Really appreciate you being here. And thank you so much to our audience. I really appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.